So you may have noticed, if you were with us last year, one of the changes that we made is fewer long introductions of speakers, which means the responsibility is on you to read their bios, which are available to you. They're in your booklet. They're also on the website. And some of the speakers, the moderators will introduce speakers where it makes sense to do that. So our next panel, and I see our panelists making their way up here, is focused on what sits at the intersection of our First Amendment right to free speech and the use of social media and the implications of that for society and for democracy writ large. So let me invite to the stage, if you guys come on up, if you would, Laura, Alex, and Seth, if you'd welcome them warmly.
All right. Thank you very much for having us. I'm Seth Berlin. I'm going to moderate today's panel. And I am a First Amendment and media lawyer, and I've been doing that for about 30 years. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we talk with each other and speech. And so I'm actually delighted to be here at this conference because of its focus. We're going to try in the time we have, this is a fairly complicated topic, but we're going to try to deal with speech, democracy, and social media. Nothing complicated there at all. And in particular, we're going to deal with two topics. How do we deal with the spread of misinformation and disinformation on social media, including the challenges that we have in tracking it and combating it? And the second is, how do we deal with the fact that so much of our infrastructure for speech is controlled by private companies like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and the like, including legislative efforts to require them to carry content even if they don't like the content. So that's what we're going to talk about. With me on the panel, I'm delighted to also have joined me Laura Edelson, seated immediately to my left, to your right, and Alex Abdo on my far left. Let me start with Alex. Alex is the litigation director for the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. He also spends a great deal of time thinking about, writing about, litigating free speech issues. One of the cases that he litigated was to try and require former President Trump not to block people on his Twitter account because it was being used by the president for talking about official conduct and the work that he was doing as president. And he and his colleagues were successful in that case. Laura, moving to Laura. Laura is a researcher at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, where she spends time studying in a way that Alex and I don't really as a technical matter, how disinformation and information spreads through the social media ecosystem. She leads the Cybersecurity for Democracy project, which is a really fascinating project that's available. You should look at it when you have a moment on the web. It's really fascinating. She's also, I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, that Alex and I had the opportunity to work together in representing Laura, who's a bit of a scofflaw, in this area, in the sense that the way in which she studies social media and some of the things we're going to talk about got her in Facebook's crosshairs, and they sent her a legal nastygram, which Alex and I helped her respond to. But it sort of highlights, and we'll talk a little bit more about it today, some of the difficulties in actually wrapping our arms around what is going on with social media. The second thing is that she more recently, or I guess I should say more properly, NYU recently got a request for her private research materials from a House committee chaired by Jim Jordan, asking about trying to get a handle on what she's doing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But it's actually, the idea of the House inquiry is that government officials are pressuring researchers to pressure social media companies to take down what is deemed disinformation, and that is essentially government censorship. It's a little ironic in Laura's case because it's not exactly like she's on good enough terms with Facebook to call them up and pressure them, given that they threatened her with a lawsuit. So that's us. I want to, before we turn to the substance at hand, I want to highlight two other panels that are coming up tomorrow, one tomorrow morning, one early afternoon. The first one is dealing with artificial intelligence, and the second is dealing with restoring trust in the media. Those are topics that, if you're here, you might also find interesting, so I want to flag them for you. They sort of overlap with what we're going to talk about a bit. When Facebook uses its algorithm, or a social media company uses its algorithm to promote content, in some respects, that's like a mini version of AI. And there'll be some conversation and overlap there. And certainly, the ubiquitousness stuff, I'll pick a different word, the prevalence, thank you. I think I should not have had that ice cream with lunch. The prevalence of social media and its effect on the mainstream news media has actually, I think, had a significant impact on the way we all consume news, and so and the way we look at the media, the news media. So I think that panel will also dovetail quite nicely with what we're going to talk about today. We thought we would start with Laura, who is going to try and give us some technical grounding in how all this works, because I think it will inform. For my purposes, I think it's actually very useful to understand not just sort of how this works in theory, or we obviously have gripes about this thing or that thing on social media, but to actually understand from someone who studies it in a measurable and methodical way some of the conclusions. It's obviously not possible for Laura to summarize in the 5 or 7 minutes that we've allotted all of the research that she's ever done, but we asked her to pick a few highlights to inform the discussion that follows, and with that, I'll turn it over to Laura.
So I promise I'm going to keep this super short. We're going to be just skating over a few areas. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my work into the political ad ecosystem on Facebook, and a little bit of my work in the organic, the regular stuff content ecosystem on Facebook. And really what we're trying to do is just give you a sense of kind of how computer scientists approach this, and what some of the tools are that we use. So with that, let's start with ads. So it's probably not very controversial to say that Facebook ads have some problems. Among other things, they are the subject of an FTC consent decree because there is a persistent problem with Facebook allowing advertisers to target ads in discriminatory ways, including housing ads, employment ads. I think we're all aware with some of the problems with political ads as well. But how do we study the entire ad ecosystem on Facebook? So that's the kind of problem that I work on. How do we look at like this whole thing? So the answer is we collect a lot of data from a lot of different sources. So here I'm going to be talking about political ads. So we take data from Facebook's own transparency tools. Facebook has some tools to make data about political ads, including like the specific ad itself, but also how many people saw the ad, what state it was shown, and that kind of thing, available publicly. We combine that with crowdsourced data. So if you want to, you can donate your ads to my research project, any Facebook ads you've seen. And then we also take data from third parties who have data about elections. And we kind of stir that all together, and we come to an understanding of the ecosystem as a whole. And we found some interesting things. Well, one thing that we found is that Facebook they're okay at identifying which ads on their systems are political, but they still miss quite a few. So during the 2020 election, Facebook failed to identify, and the advertiser failed to voluntarily disclose about 10% of political ads on the system. And you may say, like, well, so what? Who cares? But if Facebook can't identify which ads are political, then all these other systems don't work. So there are systems so that when you're shown a political ad, you're also shown who paid for it. Facebook allows users who don't want to see political ads to opt out of being shown them. But all of that is predicated on actually identifying which ads are political. There's some more nuanced problems that creep in as well. So for example, Facebook has a policy that says that you aren't allowed to put just blatantly false information in an ad. If the ad has sort of a provably false statement in it, not allowed. And if an advertiser does that, Facebook will take down the ad. However, what we found is that Facebook was also allowing advertisers to immediately repost an identical ad. So it didn't have like any kind of persistent checking of like, are we seeing the exact same ad again? Also a problem if you can't identify which ads are political is that your other policies around who can run political ads, like for example, foreign state media is not allowed to post political ads on Facebook. But if you can't identify which ads are political, then you will have trouble enforcing that policy. So something that we found is that Chinese state media, they're one of the long-term violating advertisers of these policies, by which I mean over several years, Chinese state media was repeatedly posting political ads. They'd be taken down and they'd just post them again. So that's some of the issues and some of the things we found in ads. We also study organic content. And I think—
Before you get to organic
yeah.
content, I just want to mention one thing about the political ads, which is, if you may remember that Facebook said, we're not going to take new political ads for the couple, was it 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
Yep, 2 weeks.
2 weeks before the last election. And if you're not able to identify what's a political ad, ads get through, and that's what happened. So
yeah.
I just wanted to add to that.
We found some of those too. But moving on to organic content, I think is again not very controversial to say that organic content on Facebook has a bit of an extremism problem. I'm sure you've seen very polarizing, hyper-partisan, extreme content in your Facebook feed. And we're coming to understand that the reason why that's the case is that recommender systems for content are very often engagement-based. They're trying to optimize for user engagement. And what that means is that very extreme, very polarizing content is often very attention-grabbing. It's very engaging. That's probably not a surprise. But what that means in practice is if you build a recommender system to optimize for engagement, then you get more extreme and highly polarizing content. And so I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of one of the pieces of research that led us to that conclusion. So back in 2020, we wanted to study the entire US news ecosystem on Facebook. So we went out and got it. It was hard, but accept that we did it. And one of the things
made Facebook really happy.
It was a hard problem. We took data from a lot of sources. But one of the first questions we had is how much is partisanship a factor in some of these big differences we're seeing? Can we ignore partisanship, or is this something we have to control for? So the first thing we did is just looked at what are some of the differences in engagement, in user engagement with news content if we just break it down by partisanship. And what we found is that on Facebook during 2020, there was much more engagement with content from far-right sources than there was from any other partisanship grouping. All the other partisanship groupings are, you can see them, they're those lines at the bottom, and then the far-right is the one at the top. But when we introduced this additional factor of looking at, well, how does engagement with content differ when we also look at whether the sources had a reputation for factualness or a reputation for misinformation, there we also find pretty stark partisan differences. You'll notice that the far right is the one category where sources with a reputation for misinformation have more engagement than sources that are factual. But number two, and to me this is the part that's really interesting, the number two category here is the far left. So what this means is that the most partisan ends of the news spectrum, they have much more engagement with misinformation than the center sources. But this is really a supply problem. What this is telling you is that there's just more information available on the partisan extremes. When we controlled for that additional volume, and we just said, well, if you look at how much engagement each individual post gets, and we look at how that differs across the partisan spectrum. We actually find that for every partisanship grouping other than slightly left, there's a misinformation advantage, where sources that have a reputation for spreading misinformation, just their posts get more engagement. And this is true, as I said, for everything other than slightly left. I don't know why slightly left is different, but it is. So I think that's a little bit of the factual grounding we wanted to give you. Just because this slide is quite loaded, I'm gonna go back to this one. So.
Make it a little easier to look at.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Laura's too modest to say this, but implicit in what she's telling you, which is that when Facebook misses 10% of the political ads, and she and her colleagues find them, they're better at it than Facebook. And I would like to just say that although NYU is a prominent and big institution, it doesn't have the resources that Facebook has, which raises the question, why can't Facebook do this? And you wonder why they got upset with her and sent her a legal demand. So that's that. I want to next turn to the free speech part of this, because one of the things that really runs headlong into abilities to combat some of this is our tradition, which has many salutary benefits of free speech. And I want to start actually not here in the United States, but in France and in Europe. There is a case which was decided by the European Court of Human Rights within the last couple of weeks that deals with regulating social media. And this is a case called Sanchez versus France. Given that it's France, it might be Sanchez versus France. I apologize to the good Mr. Sanchez, whatever, if I'm mispronouncing his name. But this is what happened. The court basically found that freedom of expression in Europe does not immunize public officials from criminal liability if they fail to promptly remove content that's deemed to be illegal, in this case, what was something that was deemed to be hate speech, even if the speech is posted on their accounts by a follower, right? This isn't their own speech, this is somebody who posted a comment. And in this instance, there was a mayor of a French village, and he was running for re-election, and there was an opponent, and the opponent apparently had a problem operating his website. So the first guy, Sanchez, was making fun of him. And some users commented on the posting, accusing the party, right, their rival, their opponent, of being, quote, allies of the Muslims, describing the city as being infested by, quote, drug trafficking run by the Muslims, and a place where, quote, stones get thrown at cars belonging to white people. And the result of that was that the European Court of Human Rights found that that could be the subject of imposing criminal liability on the counselor who's started this, even though he wasn't the one who made the comments, because even after he had warned his followers to be careful with the content of their comments, he was nevertheless convicted of incitement to religious hatred and fined 3,000 euros. Which is a little bit better now than it might have been 5 years ago, but still a lot of money for other people's speech, right? And the European Court of Human Rights stressed that due to the politician's particular status and position in the society, he or she is more likely to influence voters or to incite them directly or indirectly to adopt positions and conduct that may prove unlawful, and therefore politicians must be all the more vigilant in policing content on their websites. I tell you this parable, it's a true, not really a parable, I tell you the story because it is markedly different in a number of respects than how things would operate here in the United States. There would not be liability on a politician for somebody else's speech on the internet. There would not be, the comments that I read, even though critical of Muslims, would not rise to the level of being deemed hate speech here in the United States. And so I just flagged for you because we're going to talk about how we do it in the United States, but I thought as a way of leading into that, we would just highlight for all of you that the way we do it here and the free speech protections that we have are not the only way to do this. And I just wanted to sort of draw that contrast at the get-go. And with that, I want to turn it over to Alex to say a few more words about the obstacles to policing misinformation and disinformation on the internet.
Yeah, thanks, Seth, and it's really great to be here. Thanks to Kirk for putting this program together and for including us in it. So the major challenge is the one that Seth alluded to. If you're a regulator in the United States and you want to address what you see as a problem of misinformation, the First Amendment is for the most part going to be a barrier, at least to direct regulation. Most of the kinds of speech that critics of the social media platforms criticize those platforms for hosting are speech protected by the First Amendment. So disinformation, for example, election denialism, COVID disinformation. With very few exceptions, those categories of speech are going to be held to be protected by the First Amendment by US courts. There might be some narrow exceptions. Defamation is not protected by the First Amendment, but that's a very narrow category of speech. There might be a narrow exception for misinformation about the time and location of voting in the immediate lead up to an election. That kind of misinformation might be punishable. But most of these broad categories of information that the public has focused on and criticized the social media platforms for hosting, and that Laura and a lot of other researchers study, is protected by the First Amendment. And so most efforts to regulate that speech or to coerce the platforms into regulating that speech are going to be held to be unconstitutional by US courts. And the other main kind of pillar of free speech protection online in the United States is a statute that is often referred to as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. If you don't know what that is, it's a statute that some people credit for having allowed the internet in the United States to become what it is. And very briefly, what it does is immunize internet platforms for the speech of their users. In traditional, pre-Section 230 law, you could hold publishers liable for the speech that they published, even if they were not the ones who authored that speech. So long as they were aware of it and were publishing it, you could generally hold them liable for it. Section 230 changed that calculus for internet platforms, with the idea being that it'd be very difficult for platforms to moderate the speech on their platforms if they had to be concerned about potential liability for every post by every one of their users. That kind of liability would be crushing, and you'd see a very different kind of internet emerge. That statute has come under a lot of political fire recently from both ends of the political spectrum. Generally speaking, and I'll use the terminology from earlier today, generally speaking, the blues want to narrow Section 230 immunity so you can go after the platforms for hosting things like hate speech and harassment and disinformation. I'll come back to whether that would in fact be effective. And generally speaking, the reds want to limit 230 immunity because they perceive there to be widespread censorship of conservative views online, and they think that Section 230 provides the platforms legal cover for doing so. And I just want to say a word about 230 because a lot of the focus, there's been some focus on direct regulation, but there's also been a lot of focus on narrowing Section 230 to address these perceived problems. And I think the First Amendment is also going to make 230 reform, for the most part, ineffective at getting at the kinds of harms that people are seeing online. And that's because even if you were to eliminate Section 230 entirely, eliminate this legal shield that the platforms enjoy, most of what people are complaining about, again, is protected by the First Amendment. So the First Amendment is at the bottom for most of these concerns, the source of the legal protection, not Section 230. And eliminating it, I think, is not going to address those problems. It might address other problems. It might address the prevalence of actually unprotected speech on the platforms, and it might make it easier to hold the platforms liable for the presence of things like defamatory speech. Whether it's worth the cost of doing so, of opening them up to that kind of liability, I think is something that can be debated. But I don't think 230 reform ultimately is going to get at the problem that most people care about because, again, of the First Amendment. So let me leave it there, Seth. Is that yeah.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Can I say one thing about Section 230?
Yeah, please.
Everyone talks about Section 230 as if, this is the only reason the internet exists. And I want to be like, the internet exists outside the United States. And also, and this is where people who say, all we need to do is get rid of Section 230. All of these problems also exist outside the United States.
Yeah.
I think it's, I agree with everything you said about all of these issues, but also we have to remember that the internet is an international thing and that US laws only extend so far.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But it's a really important point, though, because the US regulatory approach has an outsized influence on discourse around the world. And it's true that 230 doesn't apply outside the United States, but it is maybe the reason why so many of those firms were started in the United States, is because they were able to benefit from this kind of immunity. And in terms of the liability they might face outside the US, my own instinct, I could be wrong about this, my own instinct is that there's a bit of realpolitik going on there. Those platforms could absolutely be held liable outside the United States, so long as they had sufficient presence in those countries to be subject to their legal process.
Which they all do.
Which most of them do, yeah. They all have a presence in Ireland, right? And they can all be sued in the EU and Ireland, and they have sufficient presence in China to bow to demands to censor their platforms for speech critical of the Chinese government, and in other regimes too. But whether they're actually held liable in a way that might put them out of business, I think ends up just being a question of whether a foreign government really wants to discourage the platform from being within its borders. Because I think there's no question that a foreign government could hold it liable for the speech that is taking place inside its borders. But I think you're right. It's not because 230 exists or doesn't exist. It's because of other factors that are at play.
And the platforms do actually do this. We had a case that I handled involving an election regulation in the state of Maryland. And when this regulation was passed, it involved political advertising. Google said, we will no longer take political ads in Maryland, period. Right? Just shut it down. So the platforms are very much able to sort of turn these things on and off. And so I do agree with Alex that they will think carefully before that other countries and various jurisdictions will think carefully before going after them. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it is a real concern. So having heard that we have a problem, having heard that we have challenges, the question is, what do we do? And on that, I think we should leave. No, I'm kidding. Good night, folks. In all seriousness, I'm going to go through some options, and some of which you've already alluded to, and I'm going to ask Alex, if I can, from a legal perspective, and Laura from a technical perspective, can we do this? So one thing is, we have speech we don't like on the social media. Can we just say, cut it out, censor it? Let me ask Laura first, can we do that? Like if you said to Facebook, no more, well, I'll give you an example, which is that they came up with, that you and I have talked about. They came and said, we are no longer going to take ads from QAnon, right? Can they actually make that work technically?
Technically, yes, they could. They would have to radically change the way that they process payment information and the way that they take ads. But a lot of why this is possible with ads in a way that it's harder with other domains is that ads are paid for, right? Ads inherently come with payment information. And we have now decades of learning from banking to figure out, this is how it's called KYC, know your customer procedures, where if someone has to provide you with banking information, which they're gonna have to do to pay you, we can usually do a fairly good job figuring out who they are. One of the problems is that the business model for Facebook ads, a lot of why they are so much cheaper than broadcast television ads or any other form of advertising, is that the platform doesn't do any vetting. They do very little vetting ahead of time on a new advertiser of, who are all the entities behind this ad. Not all ads will be reviewed by a human. And this is just very, very different than what happens when you run an ad on TV, and it's a big part of why it's cheaper.
So Facebook could do that, but it would probably raise the price of the ads.
Yeah,
Right.
by a significant amount.
And just to pause on that, put a pin in that, raising the cost of advertising, it has a basic drag on the amount of speech that you can have, right? So there is not to say that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but there's a consequence to that. I think you've already answered this question in the earlier remarks, Alex, but can you do it legally?
No, definitely. You couldn't tell the platforms that they have to suppress constitutionally protected speech. There's even a question as to, whether you could subject them to broad liability for hosting unprotected speech because of the downstream effects of that. But even if you could get around the First Amendment, even if the First Amendment were interpreted by the court to allow Congress to pass a law prohibiting the platforms from hosting, say, disinformation about elections, I'm not sure that you'd want that. I don't know that that's going to solve the underlying problem. I think the principle underlying the First Amendment is a broad commitment that we have in this country to free speech, with the idea being that some differences are best resolved without government intervention, without the government deciding what is disinformation and what isn't, but through national political conversation. And there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical about, as we've heard this morning, also reasons to be optimistic, about our collective ability to navigate disagreement. I don't think the answer to that, though, is to criminalize those sorts of differences in opinion, or even subject them to civil liability. I think the answer is to figure out a better structure for our speech environment that allows us to resolve our differences, that allows free speech to work the way that we think it ought to work.
But let me ask you this. So let's take foreign election advertising, right? That's something that actually the government does prohibit.
Yes.
You cannot, there's a federal statute that says if you are a foreign government, you may not buy advertising to influence a US election, right? And the courts have upheld this, correct?
Yeah.
So and I realize that it may not apply to some of the other categories that we've been talking about this morning, but just take that category. They could, right, they could say to the platforms,
you bear more responsibility for that. They
right.
could, and I
not only
think
not only we're going to say we're going to penalize the Russian government or the Chinese government or the Iranian government for doing this, but we're going to also penalize a platform who takes these things, right? You could do that.
You could do that, and I think there is room for reform of Section 230 that would make some sense. For example, if right now you get a court to adjudicate whether a particular post on Facebook is illegal, say it's defamatory or
Let's go with something easy, violent terrorist imagery.
well, that's a little different because it's criminal, and so they would definitely be under an obligation to take it down in terms of the example I'm going. But just take that defamation for a second. If you get a court to hold that a post made by an ex-business partner of yours about you is in fact defamatory, it's factually incorrect, it's caused you harm, you cannot get a court order requiring the platform to take that post down. Even if this person had a full and fair opportunity to defend the post that they made and a court nevertheless disagreed,
Right.
and they appealed it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, that post is unlawful defamation. Section 230 immunizes the platforms even from a lawsuit, not for damages, but just requiring them to take down the defamation.
Right.
230 has been held by courts to immunize them from that. There seems to be some room there, in my mind, for reform.
All right, so we've got a little sliver of room legally,
Yeah.
and we have a technical ability to actually ban certain narrow categories of speech, right? But I think you both agree that that's not legally going to solve all of the problems we've talked about, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you one follow-up question, Alex, if I could, which is this. Can I make Facebook follow its own rules? So let's say this, right? Facebook comes and says, we're not going to take election advertising for the last 2 weeks of an election. We're not going to take QAnon ads. We have, community standards, which says here's what you can post and here's what you can't post. And and then Laura's research comes along and says they're not actually following what they say they're going to do. And in fact, our institute at NYU is doing a better job of identifying these things than you all are. Can the government impose liability not for actually having the speech, but for having the speech in violation of what the promise is?
I think it's a complicated question. There may be some room for the government to legislate in the strand of consumer protection law, arguing that the platform has engaged in a commercial transaction with its users. There's been an exchange of mostly private user data. That's mostly what you're paying with. And in exchange for that, you're getting a service subject to these terms and conditions. And one party to that contract has not upheld its promises. And so I think there may be some room there for some consumer protection style laws and perhaps for some enforcement by the FTC, arguing that Facebook's public promises are actually deceptive to the extent it's not complying with them. I think there is room for that. Whether that's going to do enough, I don't know. But it seems to me there's at least some room there.
And I'm starting with the premise that you're probably looking at a patchwork.
Yeah.
So I'm asking questions about what you could do, not that any one of them is necessarily going to solve all problems. So let me ask you another, and again, from the technical side, from the legal side. What about if we required let's use Facebook again as an example. We require them to disclose what's going on their platform in a better way. And let me explain what I mean by that. I know you know this because we've talked a little bit about it, but one of the things that makes Facebook different, think about a political ad. If I take out a political ad and I say and I'm a local politician and I'm running for re-election, and I say, I want you to air this ad display this ad to 1,000 users in my district, right? My opponent, and it's critical of my opponent doesn't even know that ad happened, right? Because they don't see it. It's not like I took out an ad in the Washington Post, right, or the Asheville newspaper and said, here's what, if I see it in the Post, I go, oh, okay, my opponent said this about me, I'm going to respond, right? And that's the way speech is supposed to work, which is that you have speech, and if there's speech you don't like, you have counter speech. But one of the problems of social media, the social media environment, is you don't actually have the opportunity a lot for the counter speech. And so one question I have is, can we make them disclose? So for example, can I say to Facebook, you have to disclose all ads that you take? Or can I say to the Washington Post, you have to disclose all ads that you take, right? It's a question. So again, why don't we start with Laura? Can I do that technologically? Can I make them do that? And
Yes.
There's a technology that would actually make that work?
Yep, I wrote a standard. This is the thing we do when we want something to happen, is you go and you write a technical standard of here's how you would do it.
And can you say just a couple words about what would be involved?
Yeah, so long story short, there's two kind of problems, technical problems we have to solve if you wanted to say, let's just make all ads publicly transparent in some way so that the public can get at them, journalists can get at them, researchers can get at them. The first problem is that it's a lot of data. Good news, though, there are other kinds of really enormous data sets that we've had to solve some of the problems of scale. So, for example, other things that are just really large volumes of data that we've had to figure out how to deal with are star maps. Astronomical data that NASA collects is truly enormous, some of the largest data sets that exist, much larger than the kinds of data that we would be talking about here.
So it is actually a little bit of rocket science. Sorry.
Rocket science is surprisingly simple. It kind of has to be.
All right.
But,
I asked for that. Go ahead.
But, so anyway, the problem of it's a lot of data is like, yeah, it is a lot of data, but we know how to deal with it. The other problem is that, as you mentioned, right, this is one of the core issues with digital advertising, is that it's shown to one person at a time. And if you're not aware of what happens when you're shown an ad on the internet, there's a real-time auction that goes on between competing parties that want to show you an ad, and there's one winner of that real-time auction. So there is the potential, if you were to do it wrong, that information about that ad might in some way be privacy compromising. So the question is, can you make data about ads available in such a way that it's useful without being privacy compromising to users? And this is where there's been about 2 decades of research in the computer science privacy community to figure out on a technical level exactly how we do that and how we prove that we've done it. So to the 2 major questions, the answer is, yeah, we can solve those problems.
All right, Alex, you going to be a buzzkill here? So tell me what the problem is with that legally.
Turns out it's legally really complicated to figure out what kind of transparency you can mandate from the companies. But let me take a step back. So the government for a long time has been understood to have pretty broad authority to require regulated commercial entities, businesses, to disclose information about their business. Sometimes the government requires businesses to disclose that information to the government through tax forms or through licensing forms, things like that. Sometimes the government requires those companies to disclose that information to the public, things like nutrition labels and the like. The framework that applies to the constitutionality of those kinds of transparency laws, it turns out, is deeply unsettled. And it's unsettled even more in the context of transparency laws that apply not just to run-of-the-mill businesses, but businesses that are in the business of speech. And the reason why it's complicated is because transparency laws directed at speech companies, like newspapers and the like, social media platforms, might have implications for the speech that take place on the platform. And so there's a fight right now that's ongoing in the First Amendment community, and I'm very much a part of this fight, of what the precise standard ought to be for judging the constitutionality of these laws. On the one hand, some people argue that transparency laws across the board, to the extent that they implicate a platform's editorial judgment, namely its decision about what speech to leave up and what speech to take down, should be subject to the most stringent form of constitutional scrutiny, what is called strict scrutiny. And the kind of, in legal circles anyway, famous quip about strict scrutiny is that it's strict in theory, fatal in fact. Very few laws survive that kind of constitutional scrutiny. Some people argue that some laws should be subject to a less demanding form of scrutiny when they require only the disclosure of purely factual information that is uncontroversial about a service offered to the public, with the idea being that that's the kind of information consumers have a right to have about the things that they are buying and paying for, in this case with their data rather than dollars for the most part. And that scrutiny is a little bit lower. It's not, it's not a free pass, but nor is it the kind that is automatically fatal. And we may get a sense of how the Supreme Court thinks about this question next term. There are two cases that the court has not yet decided whether to take, but that most legal observers think the court will take. They both arise out of litigation brought by NetChoice, which is a trade association that represents the technology companies. In one case, NetChoice challenged a law passed by Florida that is a regulation of social media, and in the other case, they challenged a social media regulation passed by Texas. And the laws, the main part of each law is actually not the transparency provisions. It's something that we may talk about separately.
We're going to talk about that in a little bit,
the must-carry provisions of these laws. But each law also has a transparency provision, or actually a kind of string of transparency provisions. And the lower courts arrived at very different approaches for how to analyze the constitutionality of those provisions. And one thing that I'm very curious to see, and organizations like mine are very curious to look into, is what will the Supreme Court say is the right framework for analyzing the constitutionality of those laws? Because they might say these laws are categorically impermissible because they're subject to this fatal in fact scrutiny, or they might say there's room for legislatures to act here, so long as they don't unduly burden the free speech rights either of the platforms or of the platform's users.
So 2 points on that. One is, I'm reminded by there were a couple of cases involving internet companies that were just decided by the Supreme Court. In an oral argument, Justice Kagan had a technical question, and she asked this question, and she said, "You need to help us here. It's not exactly like the 9 of us are the biggest experts on the internet." So it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does about that, because some of these questions are very technical. The second is that the underlying premise of what Alex has been talking about is in part a doctrine called compelled speech, right? So we in the First Amendment world recognize that typically the First Amendment protects the right to speak. But the corollary to that right is also the right not to speak. And so one of the things that is of a concern, and this is going to come back in the last part of the discussion, is about whether the government can actually require social media companies to speak. And it comes up in sort of 2 ways. One is, can the government say, as some states have tried to do in statutes, you cannot take down content that you disagree with. You have to actually carry it in the same way that your telephone provider, for example, can't decide, well, I don't like what you're talking about, I'm not going to carry this call, right? They're sort of a common carrier, and they're required to carry all calls. So one of the questions is that. That's sort of the big question. The smaller question is in the area we're just talking about, which is, can you require a social media company to say, or a newspaper website to say, publish a database of all ads that they take, or all political ads that they take, or all organic content that they take. One way of looking at that, it's not the only way, but one way of looking at that is that you're essentially compelling their speech, and that's a constitutional problem. So that's sort of the tension there. Let me go on to one other thing. We talked a little bit about, in addition, in lieu of allowing everybody to see the speech, right? We've also got an idea of, well, let's at least let legitimate researchers see all of these ads. Like, make a database available instead of making Laura go and, like, when she said, oh, it was pretty hard, we had to get it from all these sources. Make Facebook give at least her and other people who are scholars like her and potentially journalists who report on technology, to be able to analyze this data. And I take it that because that's a subset of what we already talked about, that we could technologically do.
Technologically, yes.
And putting aside the question, which is a thorny question if you do it this way, of who counts as a legitimate researcher, right? Because then you all of a sudden have the government telling you, well, I think, Laura Edelson at NYU is a legitimate researcher, but, Joe Schmo at some other institution that I didn't get into and, might have a grudge against isn't a legitimate researcher, right? So that's an issue, for us. I take it from what you said that sort of is a subset of what we just talked about legally, and that we could do that if we want to.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I think there are a variety of transparency laws. Some, I think even under the most absolutist version of the free speech protections here, I think there is still room for transparency regulation. I think the question is going to be how much room is there, and we'll potentially get a sense next Supreme Court term. Do
you want to say just a word about there was some new legislation, well, not new, reintroduced legislation within the last couple of weeks. Do you want to just say a word about that, because it deals with transparency?
Yeah, sure. So there's a bill that's called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, it's PATA, and so people call it the PATA bill. And it has three main components.
I call it the PATA bill. You say potato,
PATA.
I say potato.
Yeah, okay.
But
okay, the PATA bill. And it has three main components. One would require the platforms to disclose certain information to the public at large. One provision would require the platforms to disclose certain information to researchers if the research project at issue had been vetted and approved from a privacy perspective by the Federal Trade Commission. And the third provision, which is actually a provision that some colleagues of mine and I initially drafted as a thought experiment, but ended up in this bill, would actually just insulate independent researchers from legal liability for studying the platforms in violation of platform terms of service, so long as they abided by certain privacy principles. And this effort was motivated in large part by our work with Laura, who was on the receiving end of some of the legal threats for these alleged violations of platform terms of service.
Thank you for that alleged.
Yeah. One of the reasons that we drafted this provision is that we realized that the First Amendment questions around transparency legislation are really complicated. And so we wanted to come up with a transparency bill that did meaningful work without running into some of the hard compelled speech problems that we were discussing. And I think that prong of the PATA bill avoids those complicated questions. But the other two definitely run headlong into them.
Can I just, I think we should talk for at least a minute about why we want transparency. Because I think that we have to think about, what do we actually want transparency to do for us, to think about what of these solutions will work. I think a concern that I have about transparency measures that are solely aimed at academic researchers is if you just look historically, who has informed the public the most about how platforms work, how, what impact this might have on users themselves, how people use platforms? It's been done by journalists. And I think that transparency approaches that leave journalists entirely out, they are not reaching the community that has had the most impact historically. I also think a constituency that's, again, often left out of the transparency discussion is users, right? I think users deserve much more transparency than they actually get about the content they're shown and why they are shown that content. They also deserve more information about what platforms know about them. Because if we're going to say that, fundamentally we want users to make better decisions, to engage better with social media, with other users on social media, how are they supposed to do that if they do not have meaningful transparency about how these systems work?
I mean, it works across the board. It's the same is true of legislators, right? If you were to go to the Congress now and to say to them, we ought to regulate social media, a lot of them have ideas about what to do, but they're operating in many respects in the dark because they don't really have their arms around how the thing actually works. And the first step in that is actually to have some transparency so that you can see it. Let me just shift gears for just a minute to you just talked to Alex about a couple of cases. One of the things that both Texas and Florida have done is to pass laws that prohibit social media companies from what they would describe as censorship in two ways. One is to pulling down individual posts, and the second is for deplatforming people. And really, if you think about this, right, as Alex alluded to in his earlier comments, the country is deeply divided on whether or not you think there is too much content moderation on social media or not enough, right? But we definitely have some amount of it, including, quite famously, President Trump being deplatformed from Twitter, right? So this is a significant thing, and it's one of the motivating forces for this kind of legislation. It is making its way through the courts. The Fifth Circuit, which presides over Texas, came out one way. The 11th Circuit, which presides over Florida, came out a different way. Usually, if there's a conflict between the circuits, it's good fodder for the Supreme Court. And they have these cases, and they're sort of mulling whether to take them. So there'll be more on this. But let me just ask, without the benefit of predicting what the court will do, because that's always a dangerous game. I just want to ask. Let me start in this instance with Alex. Is that something that is legally something they can do?
Very likely not. So the question is, can states force social media platforms to not to moderate speech that the state doesn't want the platforms to moderate? And the answer is constitutionally almost certainly no. Almost certainly these laws are going to be held to be unconstitutional.
Including because that would be compelling them to speak.
It'd be compelling to speak, and it would fall within a long line of Supreme Court cases recognizing that newspapers and parade organizers and companies that circulate leaflets to their customers have a First Amendment protected right to decide what goes on their pages, what messages are present at the parade, what information is included in these business letters to customers. And it'd be pretty an atom bomb going off in the middle of the First Amendment if the Supreme Court were to hold that states can dictate to the platforms what can and can't go, what kind of moderation they can or cannot engage in. That being said, I just want to acknowledge something. I understand the concern that motivated those laws. And I don't think the concern is an illegitimate one. The concern that motivated those laws is that a very small number of companies, and within those companies, a very small number of people, have enormous control over what can be said and what will be heard on the largest platforms for public discourse today. And I think that ought to trouble everybody. I think that ought to trouble people who are committed to free speech, because one thing that our national commitment to free speech reflects is a concern about centralized control over public discourse. And the First Amendment obviously reflects that concern with respect to the government. But the broader free speech commitment that we have, I think, reflects that concern about anybody, any centralized control over public discourse. Because if there is a small number of people that can control what can be said and what will be heard in society, then I don't think it's fair to rely on discourse to legitimate self-government, for example, which is one thing that free speech does. It's the foundation for self-government. Majorities need to be able to discover themselves. Today's minorities need to be able to become tomorrow's majorities. And the way we do that is through the free flow of information and ideas. And so I'm also troubled. Laura's waiting to pounce on me here. Okay. I'm also troubled by centralized control over public discourse. I don't think the answer is for the government to tell these platforms that they can't take down speech on the basis of viewpoint, which is what Texas's law says. I think the answer is structural changes to the centralization of control. I think the problem is really one of concentration of power in these platforms. And so the approaches that I would favor would be ones that would reduce the concentration of power, make it possible for competitors to enter the market, make it easier for individuals to exercise agency over their online experiences in a way that they right now I don't think can.
I feel bad because I've been able to say, yes, we can do this. Yes, we can do this. And this is where I have to say, a lot of why we have more options when we're talking about ads is we have more information about that content. And a lot of our options start to fall away when we're talking about organic content. So yeah, this is where I also have to say, technically there are hard unsolved problems here. We do not know how to consistently take down a conversation between, one person in Utah and someone in Texas, where half of the conversation must be taken down in one state and can't be taken down in the other. There are just hard problems there. And something else, though, I wanted to say, about the, I think like Alex, I look at these laws, and from a technical perspective, I say this is impossible. But I also look at these laws and say I understand where this is coming from. And I think where I similarly say, I don't know about this, is that you're absolutely right. What people are reacting to is the centralization of power and the centralization of control of something like speech. It's just that replacing one centralization of power with other centralizations of power doesn't really solve the problem, and it just, technically speaking, it manifests a whole bunch of problems, and legally it manifests a whole set of other issues. But I think I also agree that moving to a place where there is more interoperability, more portability, that is both a technical way through and maybe a legal way through as well.
So Alex, let me just ask you this question, because in introducing you, I highlighted the case that you litigated, which had the effect of essentially requiring President Trump not to delete or block commenters that he disagreed with. How's that different?
It's different because he's a state actor in that context. So the theory of that case, in the case that Seth is referring to, you may remember that early in President Trump's presidency, he gained notoriety for blocking critics from his Twitter account. And we spent some time considering whether we thought that was a problem under the First Amendment, because there's a doctrine under the First Amendment, it's called the Public Forum Doctrine, and the idea behind it is that when the government opens a space for speech, the government can't pick the viewpoints of the people in the room. So if there's a town hall, the government can't kick you out because you've expressed a view the government disagrees with. And if it opens up a public forum elsewhere, it can't kick you out there too. One of the more famous Supreme Court cases on this involved a theater, a municipally owned theater. This is my
They're ubiquitous.
Ubiquity, yeah. A municipally owned theater, a city-owned theater. I think that they didn't want to lease it to a showing of Hair. Is that right? Was it Hair?
I think it's Hair.
It was Hair, yeah. And the Supreme Court held, no, this is a public forum. You can't pick and choose on the basis of viewpoints. And we made the same argument with respect to President Trump's Twitter account. We said that the way he was using his account was in furtherance of his official duties, and so reflected his action not as a private individual who would absolutely have his own free speech rights to block, but reflected his action as a public official, and so had to act consistently with the First Amendment. And the courts ultimately agreed with us. The Supreme Court didn't resolve the case because by the time it made it to the Supreme Court, his term was up, and the Supreme Court dismissed the case as moot. But we'll eventually get a ruling from the Supreme Court on this. Most lower courts have now endorsed a rationale like that, like the one that we fought for, but it has not been resolved by the Supreme Court.
So I can compel a government official to speak, but I can't, or to have commentary that they don't like, but I can't compel anybody else to do it.
Yes, the government officials don't have, the government doesn't have a First Amendment right.
Can I just quickly note here, this is yet another place where the technical limitations manifest in weird ways, because there is no way on Twitter to say, I don't want to see this content, to block a user without also having these other impacts on who can speak on your page. That's a design choice. Twitter didn't have to build itself that way, it just chose to.
Right, that's a very good point. I think at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. We have 2 microphones here and here, and we'll go back and forth. So if you have questions, please approach the microphone. And let me just take this opportunity to remind folks that a question is usually a short statement that ends with a question mark. So that and I make that point just so that there's enough time to get as many questions in as possible.
My question is, what about having a platform For instance, I'm on Facebook. I haven't used it in years, but I can't get off of it. Can't I make them take me off Facebook? Like, am I married to it forever because I wanted to see what my kids were doing when they were in junior high or middle school?
You can delete your account. There's some questions as to how long your data will persist, but like you can delete your account if you want to.
Okay, I asked them and they said I couldn't.
Well, that
Did
sounds like
I ask the wrong question?
I think you need not to ask. This is one of those places that's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. But you definitely can delete your account. And I recently, because I've been toying with deleting mine because I don't really use it very much, and I recently found an article that said there was a way to download everybody's birthdays to my calendar, because that's the main purpose that I have at this point for Facebook, is that it tells me when my friends' birthdays are. And so I encourage you to use Google, that's a different one, find this article and it'll tell you how to extract the birthdays. It's apparently very complicated because they don't want to make it easy, because that's why a lot of people keep their Facebook accounts. I'm a poster child for that, but you can absolutely do it. And for what it's worth, if you couldn't, right, if Facebook said you have to continue to keep a platform, keep an account with us, that might too be a compelled speech problem, right? You have to be able to go to them and say, I mean, it's not a government doing it, but you have to be, if it was essentially government enforced in a contract, right? If let's assume their terms of service said, once you start an account, you have to keep it forever, that'd be a problem. So you should be able to do that, and I wish you luck with that.
Thank you.
It is a broader problem, though, the difficulty of moving between platforms. And one thing that the platforms benefit from is the network effect, the idea that you want to be where your friends are, which makes it hard to move between them. And even though you can very easily set up a new account, you can't very easily port over your communities to this new platform. And so Facebook is not inevitable. Facebook will not be around forever. It's only been around for about 10 years. None of these platforms, I think, will be around forever. They will shift over time. But while they are dominant, it is very difficult to displace them, and it is very difficult as a user to control your experiences online. One thing I would like to see is a lot more user control over online experiences, and for it to be much easier for people to have control over their data, and for people to be able to interact with users on other services, so that you don't have to choose between the Facebook environment and the Twitter environment. Some of the older members of the audience who used early instant messaging may remember a time when you could download one program that would allow you to talk with people on all the different services you used. And you can't do that anymore because Facebook doesn't let you, Twitter doesn't let you, they don't let you. But it wouldn't be impossible to legislate that world back into existence by requiring interoperability, which is the idea that Laura
And I will
mentioned
say,
before.
right, this is something that if you look at the life cycle of most platforms, they typically start very open. They start by allowing interoperability, having APIs, allowing third-party apps. And as they need to move into profitability, one of the things that many of them do is they start cutting off these other ways for users to interact with their services because they need to control the final surface that users see so that they can show ads. We're seeing this right now with Reddit. I don't know if you heard, Reddit went dark a few days ago, and it was because Reddit was cutting off access to third-party apps. And Reddit was doing that because of the fact that they needed to be able to show users more ads.
Yes, sir.
Two-part question connected. Laura, could you go into a little bit more detail about the algorithm auction process you touched on real briefly in your comments? And connected to that, instead of talking about laws around free speech, is it possible to force the social media companies to have an option where you can opt in for ads and no ads, so that would take care of the free speech issues, and so it's just, you might have to pay extra fee for it, but as a way to compel them to have that option for users? Thanks.
So I can talk about the ad network. I think you should talk about the legality. So yeah, when you are on the internet and you're shown an ad, in order for that ad to make it to you, what happens is a message is sent from that. If you, let's say you load up the Washington Post and you're going to see a banner ad, what happens is they recognize, oh, it's you. And they recognize it because you've been logged into the website or you have a cookie on your computer. They in some way recognize, oh, it's this person. They figure out what they know about you, your your basic demographics, maybe your interests, if those are being tracked, which they are. Other kinds of inferred interests based on your browsing history or anything else they know about you from data brokers. And then that's an ad impression that, for a woman between the ages of 35 and 45 who doesn't live in Asheville but is in Asheville right now, and it likes computer science. That's okay. That's the little profile I've constructed myself. It's a very particular one, and maybe there's 4 or 5 advertisers who want to deliver an impression that matches the orders that they filed. There'll be an instantaneous auction. Well, they'll all say like, "I'll pay this much. I'll pay that much," and then there will be a winning bidder. And
It's all done by computer, right?
This is all happens instantaneously by computer. This is all set up ahead of time, and then there's a real-time auction that happens in a tiny fraction of a second. Then the ad is delivered to me at the end. So
This happens in the milliseconds that the page is loading before you view it. On the latter question, maybe Seth can weigh in too, but I think the answer is that would probably be unconstitutional. The decision about what kind of speech, like if you think of the platform's presentation of a page to its users as the platform's speech, which is how a court would likely analyze it, then the decision about whether to include an ad or not to include an ad is a decision about whether to speak in one way or to speak in another way. And a direct regulation of it would likely have to survive a pretty high level of scrutiny. It's hard to see what exactly the interest would be, the governmental interest that would justify that level of intrusion, that would satisfy the constitutional test. Maybe you could come up with one, but it's not obvious to me just thinking here that there's one that would justify forcing platforms to give them the option of an ad-free or an ad, option. But Seth, I don't know, do you have a different view?
I don't. I mean, think about it this way. If you were so I'm from Washington, and there are a lot of legislators around, and if they decided they didn't really like seeing ads in their Washington Post in the morning, and they said, we're going to regulate it so that newspapers distributed in the greater Washington area are not allowed to have ads. That would clearly be a First Amendment problem, and they would, that legislation would be struck down. Now, there are differences between a newspaper, which everybody can read, and a social media where things are targeted. But it is, I think, very unlikely that would survive. And it's an interesting question. I mean, something like 90% of the revenue, right, for Facebook comes from showing the ads, maybe even more, right?
97.
What?
97.
97%. So Facebook. So for example, you can pay more for Hulu to get it without the ads, and that's a business decision. It's not a legal decision. I don't think Facebook has figured out a way, but maybe if they came to me and said, look, you can have a Facebook account and it'll cost you $15 a month and we won't show you any ads, maybe that'd be a good business model. I don't know. They probably have, they've looked at it, but where they really, the special sauce of Facebook, right, and Alex alluded to this earlier, is that you're the product, right? People think it's the product or the ads are the product. You're the product. They're collecting your data and they're using it to figure out what ads that they can show you that match your profile. And what they offer to advertisers is the ability to make that match, right? It's like matchmaker, right? They're like they're making that match, and that's the special sauce of Facebook. And so they don't really have an incentive to give that up because that's really the value proposition for the whole company.
The particular problem there is that so different users are worth different amounts to Facebook. A user in the United States is worth more than a user anywhere else in the world. And the rough shorthand is the richer you are, the older you are, the more valuable you are as a Facebook user. Unfortunately, Facebook, like value to Facebook of a particular user is directly correlated with how likely you are to want to be willing and able to pay for Facebook as a service. So if Facebook were to say have a $15, even something really expensive, let's say it was $15 a month, but we won't see any ads, the users who would be able to pay that are the ones who are worth more than $15 a month to Facebook.
Which is why you probably haven't seen that yet. Yes.
My question ties into the earlier session when we were talking about polarization, marginalization. And I was thinking about, in the history of the United States, we've always overcome these periods of time where we had disagreement, dissent. And I thought about, well, what got us over that hump? How do we keep, plugging through? And now for the first time, we have technology in the picture, driving the way people think, what they believe. And we have business cases. So it's about making money and technology that can create an outcome that I started imagining, well, how do we recover in a different way from the 50s, the 60s, when we had to get over these problems of polarization and difficulty? This is a totally different dynamic. How do we factor that into our way of moving forward, connecting, figuring this thing out? So can you think about that?
Laura?
The thing that I would remind folks is that technology isn't new. The printing press was a brand new technology, and I think incredibly disruptive. I think it's again not terribly controversial to say that the printing press led to the Protestant Reformation. I think it is really hard to look at the early days of radio in the United States to think about the impact that Father Coughlin had on the political conversation in this country, and to think about that wave of populism that we faced, and to say, would that have happened without radio? I don't know. I don't think so. Every time we have a new communication technology, it is massively disruptive. And it is, I'm not saying that this isn't a hard problem, but I am saying that, it's always this way, and it's always incredibly disruptive, and sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse. And a lot of how we get through that is, one, we figure out how to make these technologies better serve society, but also there's generational change, where people who, we all get better educated about how to be users of these systems, and that's just a process that takes time.
I think when Laura says generational change, she's saying the good news is that we'll all die out. But this is how I think it's a great question. Here's how I think of it. Every technology changes the ways that humans interact with one another. If you think about the history of human interaction with one another, it has gone from the relatively analog to the digital. And the reason why that transition matters is because in earlier times, we all could reason about and understand what it meant to form relationships in a society and what it meant to speak in a society, because you heard what you were physically proximate to, because the laws of physics decided whether you were going to hear that person talk. And the modes of communication were mostly the ones that you were familiar with: your voice, your decision about where to be at a particular time, the community that you lived in, and the information sources that you sought out. But over time, with every one of these technological changes, has fundamentally changed how we communicate, what information we're exposed to, who hears what we have to say. And that's true for the printing press, that's true for radio, that's true for television. What I think makes this particular transformation different is that we have a relatively small number of companies deciding on the basis of a relatively small number of algorithms what information gets heard. And those algorithms are tuned to prioritize engagement above all else. That wasn't true to the same degree when it came to earlier kinds of technologies, but even if it were true to a surprising degree, and it probably was to some, another important difference is that we just don't understand how those algorithms work. With radio, with television, with the printing press, we still understood the modes of distribution of information, right? We understood the main information arteries in society, the arteries over which people formed relationships, got news, met their spouses. And we don't have that same understanding today, because instead of having the laws of physics govern, it's the laws of Facebook amplification that govern what is possible for human interaction. And when it's all triggered around, based on engagement, that has emergent effects that are really hard to reason about and predict without the kind of research that Laura does, because it's just not obvious what's going to happen to a society when you reorganize all of our information ecosystem around the one imperative of more eyeballs on more advertisements. That's why, to my mind, the main problem is one of concentration of power. I want there not to be a small number of algorithms that decide what gets heard. And I was a biology major in a former life. And one thing that you learn in biology is that genetic diversity is really important to a population's resistance to disease. When you don't have genetic diversity, you see the viral spread of disease. When you don't have diversity, I think, in the algorithms that decide what information spreads, I think you get the viral spread of things that have learned to hijack that information ecosystem. So what I would like to see is a multiplicity of algorithms that decide who hears what, so that we don't have the monoculture that we have in algorithmic amplification online today. I think there is a way of getting there. I think it's not easy, especially with today's Congress that can't get anything done.
Well, I also think that
that's
some
how
of
I
it,
think about things.
Some of it will also not be through legislation, right? So if you look at, take Twitter as a recent example, right? Elon Musk took over, he cut the staff by a lot, it stopped working reliably, and people were looking for alternatives. And now it'll sort of remain to be seen whether there will be an alternative or two or three that will come to, be of comparable prominence. But that's how if we think about it for a long time, we can go back to sort of, people used to use MySpace. Where is it now, right? I mean, there are things that change. And if you ask, like if I want to reach my children, I can't use who are 22 and 25, I can't use Facebook. They're like, that's not for our people, right? That's for your people. That's what he says. That's what they say. So, right? And send it. So I have to send them something on TikTok if I can figure out how to use that. But that process, and I'm not sure and I'm not suggesting that TikTok ought to be the end model for all of these things, but that process is an ongoing process, and I think will continue to go that way. This is blinking at me, but let's just take the last question, and then if you'll all bear with us, and then we'll wrap.
It's a good segue. I actually was going to ask you about TikTok too. There's been some interesting state approaches. One in Utah, which seeks to regulate how it affecting minors in particular. One in Montana seeking to just outright ban it because of some implications there. I'm curious what you think of those approaches to regulation on the state level.
You want to?
I think the outright ban is clearly unconstitutional. To me, it's a very easy First Amendment case. I'd be shocked if a court did anything other than immediately hold the law as unconstitutional. The child safety bills, I think, are going to be a little bit more complicated. I think the ones that I've looked at closely, for the most part, seem like they're not done in a way that's going to withstand constitutional scrutiny. There may be a way of passing a child safety bill that withstands scrutiny, but one of the challenges is that kids have First Amendment rights too, and you can't just say all of social media is off limits to kids unless you have, checked in with, the government bouncer at the front door. Those kinds of laws generally have not survived scrutiny in the past. I don't think they're going to survive scrutiny when it comes to the social media platforms. I think they would need to be a lot more targeted and have a much clearer explanation of what interest justifies that level of invasion.
Yeah, a version of this went to the Supreme Court involving a California law that was designed to regulate violent video games sold to minors, and truly violent stuff. I mean, and the Supreme Court ruled that statute was unconstitutional, both because kids have First Amendment rights and because the showing that the state had made that this would actually solve the problem in any meaningful way didn't pass muster. So, there's obviously, each case has its own facts, but as a blueprint for that, that's really where we are, so.
Can I just, one quick closing note on the technical side of this? I think that the piecemeal approach is really pretty daunting from a technical perspective, but even worse than that is a lot of these bills, you're saying they don't look like they'll pass constitutional scrutiny. Many of them are like technologically impossible, or they have some precondition that's, where someone really did not think about the privacy issues. And this is where I would just really hope that legislators will consult more with technical folks who might educate them about some of these issues. Because again, this isn't, I do think that when we're talking about regulation, we're not talking about if this will happen. We're talking about what will happen and when. And
so I'm in favor of having more people who really understand the technology in Congress. So you want to announce your candidacy?
Oh, no.
On that note, I want to thank you all for being such a great audience. It's been our pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.